Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar. We will be talking about Microsoft 365 adoption and how SharePoint and Teams work together. Just a couple of housekeeping items that we usually run through. We are recording the webinar. We will provide a link to the recording and a link to the slide deck either later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to try to keep it to a little bit of a shorter session to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Please don't hold back your questions. You can submit them in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. Type them in there. If you have something else to say, you can use the chat part of it, and we will get to your questions towards the end. And our presenters today are Adam Levithan from Withum and then Mark Kashman from Microsoft. Adam, if you'd like to get started, I think we're ready.
Great, thanks a lot, Sasha, as always. Welcome everyone, and a special thanks to Mark to starting his day on the West Coast with us. So that's why we're going to leave the questions to the end, so his brain can warm up while we're, talking. Just a bit about me. I'm a practice manager focusing on intranets and project collaboration. Been working in SharePoint for over 14 years, and love talking about adoption. And actually, this is almost a painful topic for me. I didn't tell you that before, Mark, because I'm such a SharePoint person that I'm having to relearn skills of it's okay to use Teams first and then come in. So hopefully we'll share a little bit about that transition to myself. So that's
just what remember, you have always been the future.
I've always been the future. There you go. Whoa, wow. Thank you for that. And why don't you introduce yourself, Mark?
Yeah, my name is Mark Kashman. Thank you, Adam, for having me here today. I've been working at Microsoft for a little over 13 years, and about 10 of that has been focused on what we're doing with SharePoint in the cloud, with what we now call Microsoft 365. I've been managing SharePoint. I've managed a couple of other of our closely related products, OneDrive, Office 365 Video before it was Stream, and a couple of other things. Most currently, I'm focused on content collaboration, which is what we're talking about today, SharePoint plus Microsoft Teams, and everything in between as far as a consistent files experience and what you do to manage them. And I've also recently taken on what we're doing for administration in the cloud and getting content into the cloud migration with our big acquisition of Mover and some of the tools that we create, like the SharePoint migration tool, and other things that we do through Fast Track. But very happy to be here and obviously share a ton of information. I'm going to learn a few things because I know that you've got a new web part that you're going to show that it's going to be really interesting. And of course, to answer any questions.
Well, you must be happy that I don't work for that solution provider, migration solution provider. Then I'd be nagging you all the time about migration. Actually,
hey, we work close. I was going to say, those are some of the best relations that we have. Sometimes it feels a little competitive, but to be honest, they're usually really great relationships because the more that we can do for our tooling means their tooling gets better. And they can also provide insights into, the thing that's always been bothering us. And we get to say now, oh yeah, that's actually bothering our tool as well. Yeah. So to have more people focused on stuff. And I of course, we're always open to learning.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to be at the beginning of that scale, so it's great to work with people at Microsoft. But for all those who are not interested in our reminiscing, what our objectives today are how to explain the two solutions and meeting people where they or we want to work. And so that's what I hope you want to get out of this today. Actually, a lot of the people on the call are not technical. So that's awesome to me. And to get to know you a little bit better, we want to ask a few little polls. And so we're going to ask first, how much do you use Teams currently? So, have to put in buckets here. Could have done 1 to 5. I just did, once a day, so not frequent, a few times a day, or all the time. I would certainly be in the all the time bucket. I would assume, Mark, that you would be in the all the time bucket.
Oh yeah, I'm usually in the all the time, and I was in the every minute last week during the MVP Summit, which we, of course, we're going to do locally in Bellevue. but with the current climate change, we did everything virtual through Teams, and it was sun up to sundown, lots of video, lots of questions, lots of content, and all very successful. But yeah, that was an extreme. But for the most part, it's a lot in Teams, still a lot in email, and of course, actually creating content and getting into other creation tools that I know you're going to hit on.
Yeah, so great. So let's go on to the next question. Thank you, everyone. So really interestingly enough, 33% basically across the board of once a day, a few times a day, and all the time. And you're right, you reminded me, Mark, that we spent about 8 hours a day together last week.
Yep, yep.
That was before we knew this was going to happen, but okay. And then now we're asking the same question about SharePoint. Not too surprising, the frequency is a little bit lower. Thank you for the person who put into the chat that they don't even have Teams. You're right. I guess I should have put never as an option. And then someone else putting this would be my first time. All right, so let's close this one out. And the majority here, almost 50% of people are only using SharePoint one time a day, or one, and then the rest, 25%, all the time or a little bit. And then I know, again, these are general. It's hard to do perfect questions here, but what do you want to gain from this? And efficiency. So that would talk about that you're using it and you want to do a little bit better. Alleviate confusion because there's so many different solutions out there. And then tips or tricks. All right, and our winner is tips and tricks. And yeah, I think this webinar falls into the category, but as we said, we're going to have a lot of time for questions. So anything that you are interested in or are struggling with, please feel free to put that into the questions, and we'll get to it if we can. So thanks a lot for answering them.
I think we can start with a real quick tip or trick. This is something that is supported actually throughout a lot of Microsoft 365. But I've found that as you're creating tabs in Teams, you can type whatever you want to rename it. But if you use the Windows key and period at the same time when you're typing anything, and this is not my news, this is something that I learned through the Twitter sphere, that'll bring up an emoji typeset that you can then put emojis into the tabs to make them a little bit more clear of what they're actually up there. If it's a news post, you can use the little news emoji. So tabs support emojis, and in Windows, if you do the Windows key and period, it'll bring up an emoji keyboard.
Ooh, that's cool. All right, I will. I actually learned that from someone at an event too, so I'll show that later. Thanks for that tip.
Cool. Yeah.
All right. So also, I wanted to start in case there were people, and there were a few, about alleviating confusion. I'm going to add to the conversation, but the intention, and I've done this for many years, is to give an understanding of all that you've purchased, or maybe if some people are looking forward to getting into the cloud, you're wondering what you get for that monthly investment. And so I have sort of two different ways of describing this. One way is what the solutions are doing in your environment. So at the bottom, infrastructure. In the middle are services, so they're powering the experiences they're getting. And then on the top are the applications that you're using every day and that you're interfacing with. And yeah, the services and interface, I probably could do a fade or something, because there's overlap here. But the idea is that they're bigger, that they're decisions that you can see on the left by audience, that us as end users, people, as I know Mark likes to say, people are just using the solutions, are using the applications. Then it gets into the governance decisions of how to use those applications. And then we rely on the IT personnel to really, allow us to have all of these wonderful features. And so when we use the term Microsoft 365, you'll see here we talk about Azure. Azure is not just the place where you move digital transformation to the cloud and take your on-premises server and put it in the cloud. It is also the backbone of all of Microsoft services. So I like to point out Azure Active Directory is a really big point. I mean, it's identity, who you are, what you have access to. So that's like a #1 thing that the cloud relies on. But it's also infrastructure. It is actually the servers that power everything. It is the network that allows you to connect. And so we deal a lot with not-for-profits, networking from Africa. Now that there are African regions, you're going to that region, and then the network is actually internal to Microsoft. So it's really, really cool information. And then, fun tools, bot services, machine learning. And then you see moving up the spectrum. And you also see Windows 10 in here. And that's part of our files discussion, the integration that, it's just seamless on your desktop, laptop, well, phone too, but Windows 10 doesn't run there. That you can have all of these features everywhere. And so this is generally all you get. And there's actually much, much more with Microsoft 365. So let me know in the chat if that was helpful to sort of see all of these pieces together. Because, I mean, it is overwhelming. And trust me, this is not everything that's in there. All right, so we're going to move on. And we're going to talk. So I have nicknamed, with the help of Mark, actually, he didn't trademark it, but we're trying to find a right word to use. And land of knowledge came out, and that's kind of cool. So, there is another phrase for Teams, and we'll use that in a second, but the pages, the libraries, all of the features, and a lot of people are using SharePoint that you've grown to know. I didn't say love this time, but grown to know of SharePoint are still there and still useful. Highlighting news, connecting people, knowledge in many different formats, and then being able to build lists and integrated, sort of subsets of data and being able to display it across multiple different areas is really a power of SharePoint. So it's that display and receiving mechanism that is all fancy here, with SharePoint. So Mark, how are your feelings? I know 10+ years in SharePoint. It's hard to, make that transition. That there might be some other tool out there. What are your comments about the land of knowledge?
It's funny just thinking back, even just 5 years ago, replying to something like an analyst report where they had just a ton of questions around search, BI, application development, obviously files and files management, a couple other categories. And always our response for Microsoft was SharePoint. And then there were always the 6 pieces of the pie, or however you might have slice and dice it. And over time, the SharePoint has been optimized for certain workloads, but it's also handed off certain workloads. Now search is Microsoft Search, which is way beyond the SharePoint service. BI and business intelligence is now Power BI. Everything that revolves around communication, isn't just presence in SharePoint. It's really the breadth of Teams, and Teams is really plus. It's added a lot, not just taken over. And so it's a complement to the legacy of SharePoint. But the reality of now the way that they build the service and the way I think we see people using it is tools optimized for those certain workloads, not an all-in-one. So our responses to the analyst surveys today are very different. It's still Microsoft, but it's split across a lot of different technologies, and that's sometimes good and bad in responses, but it's usually just a learning curve, and then meet people where they are. And so if a lot of people are using Teams, if a lot of people are using Yammer, if a lot of people are just in team sites and they've been there for years, they still all have great experiences and some new experiences, but it's the blend of meeting people where they're working and providing them the tools that they need, sometimes agnostic of. And I'd be curious if we drilled into one of your poll questions, how many people are using SharePoint. If a lot of people are using Teams, they may not know they're using SharePoint, even beyond the things you do proactively. Right. But if you're working with a file that happens to be in the Files tab, you're working in SharePoint. But it doesn't matter. I know. But one thing I really like about the land of knowledge is if you think about that question, what is SharePoint's role in Microsoft 365? And a lot of it lands in that broad distribution of information where people can engage and ask questions, sometimes when they don't know the who or the what. And so they can go to a portal or a distinct site like a HR web that's been designed around go here to find and ask your HR related questions, and then flip over to your IT team. We've got a great IT website internally that we call IT Web that's completely built on SharePoint. It's got a lot of different back-end pieces depending on if you open up a ticket or if you go and, there's already been additional services, but it's all the glue that's connected. That I go to IT Web and I usually look for a how-to, or I find a number that I can call to ask for support, whatever that might be. And that's just two of probably hundreds of sites that we have and like our customers. And those are now easy to build. They're mobile by default. They're dynamic and manageable over time, and on and on. But it is knowledge. It is, how do I find the right person, the right answer to my question? And SharePoint plays a big role there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great distinction because, one of the differences in the main purpose of Microsoft Teams, and so here from the land of knowledge to the hub of teamwork, is that I like to call it the rate of communication. SharePoint was never designed for you, visit it daily for different pieces of information, but you're not necessarily working on the same exact piece of information, all the time. So the hub of teamwork is, Microsoft Teams, and that's because I have so many different areas here, and I have a little bit of a build, but it's about communications. And so there might, just for everyone on the call, you probably have heard of Microsoft Teams. I'm assuming you've heard of Skype. And so, there could be a question of, well, didn't we have all of these features in Skype? Yes and no. Teams really is a cloud-first app. So yes, there is a desktop version of it, but all of the connections, all of the services that are behind it are designed in the world of the cloud, where Skype was designed, and even SharePoint for that point. You mentioned it, breaking all of the features SharePoint had up into dedicated services. So you have to think of it that way. Even though there is so much included in Teams, it's optimized and designed for the cloud, and it's matured even over the last several years that it's been rolled out. So now is a great time that it's reached a very high maturity level. So the first one is communication, and that's your personal chats, your group chats, having meetings. There's no one sarcastic yet on this call, but we do get, well, if you could use Teams for this, why aren't you? There are reasons. One being we already had this solution. So, and also, there is a little bit different, a webinar compared to a team meeting, a little bit more control over the one-to-many conversation. Yes, there are broad meetings that we can do in Teams and have the same type of questions. So there are similar capabilities, but again, we had this for this. So this is more teamwork, project work compared to that land of knowledge, which is organizational wide. Then of course, collaborating. When I started with SharePoint, this was one of the biggest things that SharePoint's advantage over some other great portal solutions was Office 360, well, Office Pro Plus now, Office 365 just works. It opens and you're editing and you don't have to download it and all these kind of things. So it's fully integrated with all of the tools that you're used to using. Some of the things we're going to be talking about later are customizing and extending. And I think this is an amazing, different change for Microsoft, where they're recognizing, hey, not only do I'll use what Mark had said of breaking up SharePoint into best of class. You know what? People might be using other solutions. So if they want to use other solutions, let's not stop them, but let's give them a context that they can do it all in. And so, being able to, we'll show you tabs later, you can have these different apps and you can put those apps into, the teams and the context you're working. So that's really an amazing change in how solutions for Microsoft have been. And then all of this, we talked about Azure before, all of the security, all of the compliance, especially in being in Washington, D.C., that's a big deal. And the government, and we do work with some customers in the government clouds, all of the confidence that they have in all the other solutions they've been using in the cloud are behind Microsoft Teams. So, that's a lot. But again, the main thing for me is land of knowledge, organizational wide. We're going to talk about some of the capabilities, SharePoint has that Teams just uses. And then Teams is, well, this is where the name is good, that it's for teams, for projects, for working on that every day. Mark, I think I covered a lot, but what else can you add to that overview?
Yeah, I think, if we kind of stay with the legacy trend, the connectors that you saw in the previous customize and extend started with Outlook. So this was not just a Teams effort. This was something where we wanted to, as we're designing these different development languages, there's a new one for SharePoint, the SharePoint framework. Connectors were new for Outlook instead of add-ins. Obviously, they translate Teams really well, and you're starting to see those languages come together. So if you're a developer, I think one of the strongest points is if you're developing for Teams, you can easily develop for SharePoint and vice versa. If you've built a custom web part, you can bring that as a tab experience in Teams. And there's a lot of work going on to take every bit of these frameworks and really present a Microsoft framework. And the other thing I think that's changed over the past, that if you were a SharePoint developer, you had some deep SharePoint skills to be a SharePoint developer. And that doesn't mean that developers don't have deep skills today, but a lot now is more common to just web development. So if you know how to do web development, maybe you've never been a Microsoft developer and you brought into a job, building a connector, building a web part, building some logic on the back end is not Herculean compared to both the tools and the patterns that you would have done development in the past. But again, developing for Outlook is a very front-end tool. For Teams is a very front-end tool. Obviously, SharePoint has been a very front-end tool. A lot of that is now optimized to run in the client versus dependent as a service in the back end. And I think that's up to a point if you need it. Certainly Azure and other services are there to be a platform. But I think the way that they then translate to desktop, web, mobile makes the transiency of your custom component that much more so, which I think has been a huge part of the development besides the out-of-box experience.
Yeah, and that goes great to the next slide, because this was labeled about adoption, and a lot of people on the call wanted tips and tricks. And you said something that was really good about adoption and why we're at such a great point with the Microsoft solution is that you can train people once and you don't have to tell them where. And that's what I'm going to tell you where, but you just work on a file and you share a file, and it doesn't actually matter where it is. Now, the secret, I'll actually start from the bottom, is no matter what interface you're going in, it's stored in SharePoint. I think y'all can remember, right?
No, so don't whisper that. That's a big one. Don't whisper it.
It is stored in SharePoint, sotto voce. So that gives you all of the power, especially, I joke about myself, someone who's worked and their employment has been based on SharePoint, but a lot of people have worked with the solution on files, I'm sure. So you're not losing the experience that you have. You're just able to access it from different areas. And I love this explanation of, everyone has an individual library, every team has a shared library, and that works perfectly. In Teams, when you're chatting with people, the documents are actually stored in your personal library, which happens to be accessed via OneDrive. And then also, your team conversations are stored in the SharePoint library. Now, those same documents, I'll show you in a second, you can get to, if you prefer to go from a page to the documents, you can. Or you can go from the Teams to the documents. So any different direction. And then this arrow across We probably could wax poetic, so I'm going to say something, Mark, that I might not let you fully respond to, but OneDrive, the power is through the browser. And what's really interesting is that's a habit I haven't even been able to get to. And what I mean by that is if you're used to going to OneDrive through the browser, you have access to all of your documents everywhere. It's just a new habit, and I don't think it's put in for me. Now, for those people who've never used Teams before, or you're just getting into Office 365, this might be another adoption trick that, start users opening up that OneDrive file and leaving it open, and you get great search and you get access to all your files everywhere. So it's really, really helpful, but it's a sea change from what we're normally used to, which I'll show in a second. But any other comments that don't bring us down a rabbit hole that I started on this slide?
Oh no, I think the two things that I wanted to add here are just two simple scenarios and then one sort of fact behind the scenes. One scenario, like you're seeing today on this particular presentation, was something that Adam shared from his OneDrive that Withum, provided for him, and he sent it as an email invitation to me. I was requested to put a code in. Once I put the code in, I was then able to access that. And then what I do to make things easier for me is once I have access to the file, I actually pin it as something that I'm working on in my Windows taskbar, so that now on the PowerPoint, I can right click and just go right to this file. And it's stored all the way over in Adam's tenant, which to the intranet and the speed of things really is just like I'm opening up any file. But obviously the invitation process is from OneDrive through Outlook to my desktop PowerPoint, basically. The flip side would be if in another scenario, I hired Withum to help us with our marketing for government industry. How can we harden, what we're promoting to them? What are some tips and tricks that we know government agencies require? And that might be a longer project involving a statement of work, guidelines, obviously materials that are being created. I would probably invite Adam and his team to a new Teams team that I would create. We can share files, we can have conversations, we can hold meetings, that can all be recorded. And the ownership would be Mark and Microsoft, whereas the ownership today is on Withum and Adam. And that was the second point that I wanted to paint after the scenarios is as you're deciding what tool to use when, once you're kind of beyond the what does each tool offer, a lot of it depends on who needs access and who's the owner. If it's just two people like Adam and I working on this document, we really had no need for Teams, and that's not a knock to Teams. But if we were working on a set of multiple files like the SharePoint conference, or if the SharePoint conference were to be continued in the future with Ignite, that's for us usually several hundred people working together. And no way I would do that through OneDrive. I would set up a team and create a folder structure that made sense for all the different deliverables, for demos, for presentations, for booth duty. And the end result is still a really great working environment. The ownership is then of the team, not of the individual. But the real fact of the matter that I'll just basically reemphasize what Adam led with was everything that I've been talking about, OneDrive, Teams, and even SharePoint. The basis of where your content lives, the content service, is SharePoint. And the consistency of know which application I start or end in. Once I'm familiar with what it is, it's a consistent file experience. And of course, for IT, it's a consistent set of controls you can put on that content.
Yeah, that's great. And that was not actually a hypothetical because being a presenter at Ignite, I was in that team and using it with thousands of people. So
That's right.
This is the start of the tips and tricks section. So for yourself, for your coworkers, what are you getting yourself into? So here's an example of, so we actually have a solution called One Window, and we'll talk about the brand new Teams web part in a minute. And here on the left-hand side, what you can see is you can see my desktop, my Windows Explorer, and you can see it says Withum Smith Brown, which is the full name of our company, Withum, and you can see One Window V2. And actually, we have a naming convention because we're made up of several different organizations, mainly advisory, tax, and audit, but we are Withum Digital. So you see the WD, and then you see the site name there. and you see a folder called releases. And well, you see folders that have the releases in them. Notice in the center that I'm in Teams. I am in the Teams channel of the One Window version 2 releases, and you can see the folders. And if I really wanted to access them through the SharePoint site, on the right-hand side, you see the SharePoint site. So the same exact documents can be accessed anywhere. So fantastic user experience, fantastic adoption. You know, if there are users who don't want to ever use the browser, that's okay. Your IT team can synchronize document libraries for them, or maybe someone will have to, well, nowadays it would be really bad to touch someone else's computer, but in general, that wouldn't be a bad phrase. Teach them how to synchronize one library and then always be there. And also something, I mean, it's been over 2 years now, but there's something, files on demand, that it looks like all of your files are actually on the computer and they are not. So that's a wonderful synchronization piece that allows you the full experience of your file explorer when the items are in the cloud. Huge benefits to your organization for that, but that's a whole nother session. So all right.
Well, a little tip and trick here, which you just touched on, is a new feature in Windows called Storage Sense. And Storage Sense kind of plays off on where disk cleanup really left off, but it really takes it to the next level. But if you go to Storage Sense, you can go in and say, you know, delete my recycle bin every once in a while. But now you have options for OneDrive where you can say, if after 30 days I haven't used a file or a set of files, move them off my desktop, keep them in the cloud. This is not a delete motion. This is a clean up your desktop motion. And it does it flawlessly. It does it really nice. Works through the sync client. Obviously, it monitors the activity. And surprisingly, I was working with a file I normally work with, and I had turned Storage Sense on. And of course, it had moved it back to the cloud. This is a couple 100 meg PowerPoint file. And, you know, I was a little surprised that it didn't just pop open. It didn't take very long, a couple more seconds. But I had forgotten that it wasn't locally on my drive because Storage Sense had cleaned it up. I hadn't used it in a while. But anyway, it's a great tip. If you don't know what Storage Sense is, go in and look at the different options that are the OneDrive integrations with the sync capability.
Right, that's a great point. And also, I mean, I made a bad joke about the time we're dealing with and all working from home and being locked up. So all of Mark's stuff, all of my stuff is in the cloud. So we can walk to any store and buy any computer and log in with our Office 365 account and have access to every single one of our documents because it's not dependent on a network drive. It's not dependent on really anything from our company except for our identity. Okay, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit, but I can do my work on anyone's computer, and I'm sure Mark can almost completely do all of his work. And that's what this is too, that your documents are accessible, you know, in Office 365, almost fully functional in the browser itself, which is great. So just amazing for flexibility.
Yeah, and I think one last point on files is it's not a copy of your files in all of these different areas. It's really a window into a single source of truth with the same capabilities. We had mentioned it before. You can sync files from all these locations. You can right click and do lots of different actions and activities on files. If we're co-authoring, I can work in the browser while Adam is working on his desktop, but we're working on the same PowerPoint file, like I had mentioned, stored in his cloud. And on, the capabilities, our intent is that we can do with, whether it's share, sync, co-author, protect, move, copy, those kind of things. It's all based on the value of SharePoint on the back end, but you're getting a window into those files and folders, but it's not a copy. It's definitely a single source.
That's a really great point. And so actually, I'll go through the slides really quickly, Mark, that we've talked about, and I can actually open up a sample site so we can show instead of just using the slides. So a few different tips that Mark has a great blog about this, but we'll show them in person. Is that you can, so this is Teams, and in just, actually, you know what, I forgot to say something, just to make sure everyone's familiar. So Teams has a, let's see if we can do this really quick. We'll do pen. So Teams has a team, which if you're used to SharePoint is equivalent to a site, you know, an organization of a group of people. It also has an Office 365 group quite literally behind it, so a group of people. Then it has channels, whoops. So usually these are topics within that team. So having, you know, many channels allows you to keep that conversation going. Not everyone might be interested in all of those channels, but they can follow them. They can, you know, check in each time, and you can see that it's organized so you can understand what is going where. And then something I'll admit is a competitive advantage are tabs. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So there's some that are out of the box. Oops, oh well, that was bad, but posts and files. And then what we're talking about here is you can even put a Office document directly in. And again, I'll show you that in a second. So again, just high-level overview I should have done before: Teams, channels, and tabs. So in tabs, you can do the Office document. You can actually even, you know, we talked about the power of engaging your users with news and how that's been optimized over time with SharePoint, and then even putting it in an app. So with that said, let me go to my demonstration environment, and I actually have two, so I have to remember which one's which. All right. So here we have one demonstration environment, and I did it just very simply. I have an IT team. Makes sense. A lot of people probably would have that. This IT team is backed. It is a team site backed by a Microsoft team. We have some general channels here, and then we have the tabs. And so the first tab actually is being able to put the site itself directly into your frame of view, into a tab. So again, if you're spending all your time every minute, as Mark had said, in Teams, instead of then having to go out and go to another site or browser, you can do it in Teams. And just for the record, this is a demonstration environment. I'm using the browser. There is also an application, which I'm not going to drag over now because I don't know what chats are open in my my personal application, but because I'm using multiple accounts, I did the browser. So it is almost fully functional in the browser, and then there is also the Teams application to download. Then the next item that we can do is news. And so I had just done the news. Oh, actually, that's not true. I've set up the news because you can do it from any site. This is not the news from the IT site. You can see this is actually the landing page, the home page of my sample intranet. And so I'm getting all of the news that are coming from the corporate communications and not just the IT news. So here I have the connection, and I could have named this tab better, but I have the connection to the whole organization compared to just my IT team. And so what's great about that is you're able, again, to meet people like ourselves where they are. And you can put this tab in every single Teams. Another, I guess, trick is there are actually templates. So you could create teams that have, you know, preset channels, preset tabs now, I believe. So that's really a good thing. And then someone had asked, how did we get this there? And what I'll do is I will add one of the a document. So here are a lot of the choices. So obviously your Microsoft choices. I love Polly. Polly is asking polls like we did earlier. But then you can see all of these other solutions that can go right into a tab. And then there are further ways to create your own, which I'll show you in a second. So for here, I'll just do PowerPoint. And let's see if we have any. There we go. All right. So I'm going to do my NIST. Speaking of security, another thing that we do a lot here. So again, it's that easy. The person who asked about how do we do this? There are a lot of other ways you can go to different places. You can different sites. A lot of flexibility with what I just did, but I just wanted to do the quick version of it. Also, the same person had asked a question about storage. If you could be a little I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. So if you could add a little more information, we'll answer in QA time. So that is how to use tabs. I did that really quickly because I want to honor the question. Yes, yes.
I want to throw out a quick tip. This is one of my favorite things, especially with SharePoint content. You can stay here on the PowerPoint, or you can go to the home. The home will probably showcase a little bit better. But when you're on any tab, and specifically with SharePoint content, in the upper right, those two opposing arrows that will expand the canvas. In Teams, obviously it gives you more space. And for SharePoint, a lot of times you're using different sections and columns, and it'll resize to your screen and the space that you have. But now with the SharePoint content, whether it's a page, a list, a document, my next favorite thing is you can click the button just to the left of it, which is the discussion button. And it really highlights the value of when you bring SharePoint content into Teams and you want to have a private conversation about it with your team members of this channel or this team, you can do that. You can mention somebody, hey, what do you think about what the One Window Workplace team is now offering, or whatever the conversation might be. But the extreme is that if you bring in a SharePoint list, have you ever in the past been able to discuss a SharePoint list side by side with the list itself? And the answer I know is no, but it's really amazing to be able to have that sometimes very private discussion with your team on either team content or even things that are out in the intranet.
That's a really good point. And yeah, so I mean, it's that database that you're looking over. Maybe it's not project tasks, but it's submittals. We do it for SharePoint Saturday. Submittals to be able to look at all of the different submissions without knowing who did it, and the list, and the title, and the topic, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, have the conversation right next to it. Great, great points. Very cool. Where, this document one's kind of fun. Like, how have you used this one successfully in all of the teams that you're a member of?
Yeah, if you are working on a file and sometimes you're expecting a few people to layer in their ideas or to work on a slide, I might have somebody from the licensing team help me with the licensing slide. I might have somebody who's from our Microsoft Consulting Services help me on an architectural diagram. And if I have that as a team where I'm building out not just one piece of content, but I might have something that's a lead into a whole track, I would invite a lot of people to work in the document. And I mostly put it as a document as a tab in Teams when I want people to be able to find it easily. And if I'm expecting to ask questions in the conversation, and I can just refer over to the tab, just go to the tab where you see the document. It gives a real nice feature set. The expectation would be you're loading this file from where it's stored. It might be in the team. It might be coming from my OneDrive. But to the point earlier, it doesn't move the file. It keeps the file where it's at, and then gives the full feature set of PowerPoint Online, or what we call now PowerPoint for the web. And as you can see at the top here, it gives you the full access to be able to do what you need to do. And it also adheres to permissions. So if I give somebody permissions to view the file, they'll be able to view it but not edit. And vice versa. If I invite them to edit, they can do that. There's other things you can do to manage and control content. But the real essence here is I'm using a tab and maybe even in a cache. And I think that's one important thing. If you add a tab, you can easily remove it when you don't need it. It doesn't mean you delete the file. It just removes and saves some space. You only have so much space at the top before it starts to cascade into a dropdown. So if you aren't using one of these tabs, remove it and optimize it for where you're pointing people to. The other nice thing is if I have the word PowerPoint by default, I can of course rename that and make it a little bit more obvious, and you can tailor the environment to make it easier to work with other people.
Great point. All right, so moving on to a brand new capability that's really cool. You can do this at home. We're doing this with some of our clients. And so if you can see here on the left-hand side, now you need to be a Teams administrator here, but you can add an app. You can basically create a custom app that you can put on the left-hand side. So in this case, I've really creatively named it, intranet. And here it's a tab of the home page. So now, my organization can really live within Teams, and they can see the same experience. Actually, a little bit different, because knowing that there's a little less real estate, this is an alternative page to the normal landing page. But we have, company news is highlighted. We have important links, really easy to access, company events, so all of the great information you come to expect on your portal home. Now, the interesting thing here too is this app could be for the entire organization, or it could be for a smaller group, because it's controlled by a policy, and you could select who has access to that policy. Then something that we've been doing for our clients is having my information. And so this page here is a little bit about you, the sites that you have access to, the quick links that you can edit. So this is another thing that in the one window solution, we have the ability to select items and change those items from a list that's been approved. Also coming soon, connecting to To-Do is a set of reminders where a central owner can say, well, we know you need to do your quarterly review, and adding a group of people, that group of people automatically will get a task assigned to them with a start date and due date in their To-Do. Actually, you know what? I'm just realizing, Mark, that was missing off of the applications. Gotta find that To-Do icon.
Oh man.
So
To-Do is amazing.
Yeah, this is another web part, and I guess maybe that's another secret is start using To-Do, tip and trick. So this, again, it's not choosing what to use. It's just saying if people are really working on their projects and really spending a lot of time in Teams, that you can bring that information that your communications office is working really hard on to their working environment. I think this is one thing, Outlook doesn't do. Maybe they'll do it in the future, but as of right now, it doesn't. So this is a great advantage, and we're doing this with Teams all the time. And the last thing, I almost feel like doing a drum roll, but to satisfy a need of some of our customers, you are seeing this almost for the first time, because I know one of my customers is here, and I have shown it to him, and he approved, is a Teams web part. And so what you see here is actually a mock-up of Withum's website. I actually have to move some content, so I don't actually have my team live yet. But again, featured news, some important documents that are actually, when it's finalized, going to be personalized. We have organizations that have different, around the world, so they need different HR documents, and so this will be able to present their documents to them, not confusing, one benefits package for another. And then, another view of just normal news items down here. And then what I'm talking about is over here on the right-hand side is a Teams web part. And so this is displaying, our company announcements. So we are, as I mentioned, advisory, tax, and audit, and we have lots of cute babies. So we like to announce when someone's joined the organization, when someone's received their and passed their CPA exam, other common announcements. and we call it, Withum, the Withum way and Withum life. And so we're going to be able to put that onto the homepage here and meet people, because actually our tax and auditors are now adopting teams and working with clients directly. And also we have something called Withum Experience that is in between. So they're doing their work in that team, and this allows them to be in teams or also be able to see that information, in both places at the same time. And then another use case, I personally, because of the Washington, D.C. area, we deal a lot with not-for-profits. So this is our not-for-profit practice site. So again, talking about the land of knowledge, we have different areas. We actually have a great podcast. We have some internal processes, lessons learned, getting started for new people in the organization who want to learn if they should join the practice. And here, people are, again, doing work in teams, and they're sharing their new client news. And then once a quarter, we actually highlight some of those new clients that have been added. So in some way, it's slightly redundant, but it's using exactly it's the conversation, it's the announcement, it's the celebration of the new clients, and then it's the communication to the broader spectrum of all of Withum that, these are the select items that are our new clients and that are that we are working with. So it's, that educational, that news information. So I'd be very interested if you want to comment in chat if this is something that you'd be interested in learning more about. This is available in our one window package. Mark, you have any thoughts about this? Putting him on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I honestly, when you see the blend of integrations that Microsoft is providing or the capabilities that our partners are able to build, and some of the work, that has yet to come, really takes the point of where are people already working? Where does the content already live, or where do you prefer it to live? And instead of having people always switching applications, and to the point of switching context, which can be challenging, especially throughout the day, always hopping around. We all have multiple tabs and multiple windows open, but when you're actually focused in doing a task and you're maybe just maneuvering through a couple of people's comments and a little bit of content to pull out some of what you need, keeping people where they're at is really important. We think one of the big values that SharePoint provides to teams is a real simple one, and maybe a tip. But if you put a lot of context on a page like you have here, obviously we're talking about the Teams web part, but imagine if you had some documents, some quick links, and a video or a key PowerPoint. To do that in Teams, and again, not to knock Teams, that would be 2 or 3 tabs. But you can create a really nice mini that has everything laid out with maybe some additional text on the page, especially with something like you had with Withum Life, might be a welcome to the team. When you have people joining for the first time, here is our company motto. Here is a welcome message from our leaders. Here is a PowerPoint to familiarize yourself with the workspace physically and some of the tools digitally. Information might be, you can really build out a really nice experience as a page, but put that in Teams because you expect them when you have questions, and vice versa. If you want to send them to a portal that's not just one page, but a whole breadth of content, and you want them to be able to ask a question or provide feedback, in context where they do that is really important, both for you to improve engagement, because again, if somebody has to leave a page, the likelihood that they will or come back is very low. And to lose the context, they may, just forget what they were going to say, or grab a link and into somewhere. Sometimes, if you make somebody do too many steps. So I think it's really important what you're doing, bringing the conversation where people are or where the content was maybe for many years, and vice versa. Obviously, the importance of being able to bring that into Teams is a huge part of what we're working on, and a lot of what we talked about today.
Great, thanks for the feedback. All right, so now on to the questions. And also, if you're, so please write in some questions, more tips and tricks, questions, pains. And then also, if you want to experience this, we are doing a virtual customer immersion experience, and that is a formal Microsoft name. And what I like to say, it's a wonderful venture into a mythical land of Contoso. And that is a company that's set up that has all of the solutions that I showed you in that one slide, personas. And so you can really kick the tires, and we walk you through some scenarios, and you can experiment yourself without having to ruin your own environment or have an environment. So we'll be posting this deck, and there'll be more coming about this, but that might be a next step into venturing into learning about this. So I'd be curious, there's a comment, it's not a question, but I'll ask you anyway, Mark. Someone commented that the up and coming Zoom has been getting great press, and it is a good tool. Did better with slower bandwidth than Teams. So I'm just curious if you know or can speak of, how is Teams improving itself? Either, let's just say in response to COVID and a lot of network stress right now.
Well, I know that my corporate vice president, Jared Spataro, put out a really great blog post that talked about the increase, and they were real specific around the initial hit of use in China, in how Teams usage went just skyrocketing, up into the many hundreds of percentage difference than what we would think of as normal. Spikes are normal, but this was a huge spike. And so there was a lot of learning and a lot of adjustments to support that. And then as it started to span across the world, the team has just been doing a lot to scale the service in a way that wasn't even projected. So that, in addition to the common learning curve of as more people use the service, which again, we were on a really great trend and always very competitive with Zoom and GoToMeeting and others, even with our own legacy to replace it in an efficient way. A lot of it for us is learning, what needs to be optimized. There are a lot of things that they're now fine tuning, some things I can't talk about, how they actually are just optimizing the service so that it's a great experience. And if you really squint at the details, 720p versus 1080p at certain peak times might not be the difference in a critical era, because you just want to be able to see somebody and converse with them. But I think it's great that Zoom has been able to respond, because there is the whole world out there, and we're not trying to capitalize on everybody uses Teams, but a significant amount of our customers are using Teams. And we also made it, like a lot of other companies out there, a lot easier to get in these times. So there's a free version of Teams. If you're already using Teams, and you've been using it more than normal, it's scaled up, and we're really tracking that. And we've hit a couple of bumps and learned a lot, and of course adjusted for it. But to see that Zoom is successful and Teams is successful and others in this space, I think that just means people are being cared for and taken care of. If one is doing better than the other is not a focus for us. A lot of it is whomever's turning to use Teams, A, they have access to it, and B, that it works for them. And back to that MVP summit, that was up to about 2,000 to 3,000 people who would have traveled here normally. And even though we love to see people in person and network and hear a lot of stories beyond just information that we're sharing and questions they have, it scaled really well to be able to engage and do what we normally do. We want to hear feedback from our MVPs that are going to demand from us to do better. And if you look at that from a people feedback, what Zoom and Teams and others are getting is metric feedback. When you hit the service at this scale, what do we need to do differently? How many cores do we need to add? What can we minimize to make it optimal for features that aren't maybe critical for the video component? So I think there's just a tremendous amount of learning, and certainly competition is always good, but in the face of COVID-19, it's really just been all hands on deck, and that's beyond Microsoft.
I also think the interesting thing too is design choices, right? Like some of the design choices are because Teams was designed to then record the meeting and have it directly in stream. So you talked about the quality of video. I've never tested the Zoom with quality video, and actually I was just on a remote meeting with 65 people. So it's great, yes, that you can have that 24 view of people, really small and controlling the bandwidth. So they're just designed for different things, a lot of overlap. So it's really interesting, you know, the purpose between the solutions. And I think the benefit of Teams is the integration with everything else. And it can be a detractor, right? Because it's taking other areas and capabilities into consideration. So two quick more questions. More integration also. Someone had asked about a way to integrate with on-prem SharePoint. So I guess, you know, just a little bit about that. I mean, if you have both, if you have hybrid, you could add we didn't show it, a SharePoint library, or at least as a page into Teams. You could, you know, you could definitely do that. More specifically, Mark, and I don't know if you know this, is there any thought of more integration with SharePoint 2019 and Microsoft Teams if you're in a hybrid world?
Yeah, it's not a depth type approach. A lot of it is if you have, like you said, hybrid setup with single sign-on, and I as Mark through Teams happen to sign in or land on a page that somebody put as a tab, it's going to do what it would do in the cloud. It's going to ask me, who is Mark and does he have access? And a tab will do just the same. So if I have access to that site, if I went to it in a Chrome, Mozilla, or Edge browser, same as if I was going through Teams. So if you've got good single sign-on setup, my one encouragement would be if you have content that you're consistently collaborating on and you want a better experience, consider, especially in a hybrid mode, moving some of those collaborative spaces to the cloud. Doesn't mean you have to move all of your SharePoint farm, but maybe your team sites workload or certain teams that are working more collaboratively or in a distant way. And when you do that, you'll open up not only the ability to use more of the team's infrastructure, but you'll have sort of cloud-born content everywhere. Is going to be a little bit easier to use and access through Teams. But that doesn't take away from hybrid or the things that you haven't yet decided to move to the cloud. It's there when you need it. There is an experience across on-prem and online. And certainly if you need to, you can optimize by migrating a set of content and optimizing. Or like we did when we transitioned to the cloud a number of years ago, we just put a stake in the ground, team, I should say, put a stake in the ground. Any new collaborative space that gets created now gets created into the cloud. We had still, I think, about 6,000 team sites that were deemed critical that were then going to move at some point. But for a period of time, there was on-prem content, and anything net new greenfield was done in the cloud.
Thanks. And then the last, I'm going to class it as an integration, and I know who's asking this question. So even with the full SharePoint experience or the full files experience in Teams, there is some difference with how PDFs work. So do you know, coming down the road, if there's going to be more integration, you know, like being able to combine PDFs in Acrobat without downloading them, printing them, you know, directly through Teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly, I'd have to look to see what the exact experience is. I know that there are still some, what I would think of as higher end document library capabilities that we're starting to plumb through that common control, which is then the files experience in Teams. There are some notions like right now we have great integration with Power Apps and Power Automate, yet when you go into Teams, you wouldn't be able to access that functionality. And that's something the team is working on. And I can point this person to a blog that I wrote that highlights the value of the common experience, but that it also lists out the main areas that aren't yet exactly the same. But from a PDF perspective, there's a lot of work we're doing with Adobe just from pure how do we store and interact with files all the way through how you can use Adobe Reader and Adobe Acrobat with keeping the file in place. And some of that work is already there. If you do it from the SharePoint side, you should have a great viewing experience. If you're an editor and you have Adobe Acrobat, you should be able to do that. And that actually opens it up in the Adobe web versions, not just their plugin that we use, but actually their apps that they use in the web. And that's also true for work that we've done with DWG files for for industrial type design and layering, so that spacing on the name of the company, and that'll come to me in a second. There's some distinct work that we're doing to make it so it's a great experience in the web, but not lose that capability of storing in the cloud. I'll do some light testing and some asking around and follow up, but that should be something that you would expect no matter where you access that PDF file in the future.
Thanks so much. All right, well, we went a few minutes over. Thank you, everyone. If you have any further questions, please, you can send them to me, to Sasha, to info@Withum, and we can happy to answer them. Thank you for joining us. Mark, always wonderful chatting with you. Thank you for spending the early morning with us.
Yeah, thanks.